Imagine a man who rose so quietly that even when he was in the center of one of New York's most powerful organizations, most people had no idea who he was. He didn't flaunt wealth, didn't court attention, and didn't let his face become familiar in tabloids the way others had. Yet within the shadows of Manhattan and the Bronx, his name carried weight. Liborio Barney Bellomo was a figure who understood the value of invisibility, a leader who learned that survival came not from the loudest move, but from the most careful one. His story was not about headlines or spectacle. It was about the art of staying one step ahead in a world where even the strongest could vanish overnight. Liborio Bellomo was born in East Harlem in 1957, in a time when the old neighborhoods of Italian immigrants were still thick with tradition, family loyalty, and the presence of men whose influence was felt more than seen. The streets of East Harlem were layered with history. Decades earlier, Lucky Luciano, Vito Genovese, and Frank Costello had walked those same avenues, shaping the future of organized crime in America. By the time Barney was a boy, the Genovese family, one of the most disciplined and secretive of New York's 5 families, still maintained a strong grip on the area. Growing up, Barney was not the type to draw attention. He wasn't reckless, and he didn't crave the spotlight. He watched more than he spoke, studied how men interacted, and learned quickly that respect was earned not by noise but by presence. He saw older figures in the neighborhood who carried themselves with quiet authority, and he understood early that power did not always come with shouting or aggression. It came with control, the kind that didn't need to announce itself. By his teenage years, Barney was already drifting into circles that gave him a path into the underworld. He wasn't the stereotypical street tough. Instead, he was reliable, steady, and smart. Older men noticed that he didn't make careless mistakes, that he listened more than he talked, and that he carried himself with respect. These qualities made him stand out in a world where impulsive behavior often led to quick downfalls. He became known as someone who could be trusted, someone who didn't fold under pressure. In the 1970s, as he grew into adulthood, the Genovese family remained a fortress of discipline, even as other families grew reckless. The Genoveses prided themselves on secrecy, tradition, and structure, avoiding the flamboyance that drew attention to bosses like John Gotti and the Gambino family. For Barney, this culture of discretion fit perfectly with his personality. He didn't want to be a headline. He wanted to be a survivor. He began working under established Genovese figures, gradually earning his place. He became involved in rackets that reflected the family's strength: construction, labor unions, and gambling. Like the mentors before him, he saw the value of embedding the family into industries that looked legitimate on the surface. By controlling unions and construction contracts, the Genoveses ensured steady streams of income with minimal noise. Barney proved himself adept at managing these delicate operations. He understood how to apply pressure without drawing heat, how to reward loyalty without showing weakness. Through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, Bellomo rose steadily. He gained the trust of Vincent Chin Gigante, the enigmatic boss of the Genovese family, whose eccentric public persona of wandering the streets in a bathrobe hit a razor-sharp mind. Chin valued men who shared his preference for discretion and patience, and Barney embodied those traits. He didn't rush, didn't seek unnecessary fights, and didn't court attention. He was, in many ways, the next generation of the Genovese philosophy. By the time he reached his 30s, Barney was considered a rising star within the family. He was young compared to the older capos who had dominated for decades, but he carried himself with maturity beyond his years. His ability to manage crews, settle disputes, and expand influence without unnecessary noise made him invaluable. While other families were rocked by FBI indictments and public wars, the Genoveses remained strong, and Barney was part of the reason why. In the 1980s, the mafia world was under siege. The commission trial had crippled leaders across the 5 families: Anthony Corallo of the Lucchese's, Carmine Persico of the Colombos, and bosses across the city were sentenced to long prison terms. Yet the Genovese family, with its discipline and secrecy, weathered the storm better than most. Barney's rise during this time was no accident. He was a man who understood the value of silence, and in an era when wiretaps and surveillance were tearing apart families, his ability to operate without drawing attention made him invaluable. He became involved in key rackets in Manhattan and the Bronx, overseeing construction deals, gambling operations, and union activities. His presence grew, but not in the public eye. He didn't flash wealth, didn't pose for cameras, didn't cultivate a persona. To outsiders, he was barely known. To insiders, his word carried weight. Soldiers respected him, captains relied on him, and higher-ups trusted him. What set Barney apart was not just his ability to earn, but his ability to endure. Many young men in the mafia burned out quickly, either falling to law enforcement or succumbing to reckless violence. Barney, by contrast, moved carefully. He was ambitious, but not careless. He sought growth, but not attention. He seemed to understand instinctively that survival in the mafia was less about seizing every opportunity and more about choosing the right ones. By the late 1980s, Bellomo was firmly established as a capo, leading crews that operated lucrative rackets across the city. He was no longer just the quiet young man from East Harlem. He was a key figure in one of the most powerful crime families in America. His influence was expanding, his reputation solidifying, and his future seemed wide open. Yet the very qualities that made him successful, his caution, his discretion, his patience, also meant that he was often overlooked in the broader narrative of organized crime. While headlines screamed about the flamboyant bosses of other families, Barney's name rarely appeared. And that was exactly how he wanted it. His story was not about chasing fame. It was about building quiet power that could last. The boy from East Harlem had grown into a man of influence, a capo whose authority stretched across neighborhoods and industries. He had risen by being reliable, by being patient, and by avoiding the mistakes that destroyed so many others. But his journey was only beginning. Ahead lay the challenges of the 1990s, when law enforcement pressure would intensify, when alliances would shift, and when even the most careful men would find themselves tested. By the end of the 1980s, Liborio Bellomo's name carried quiet weight in the neighborhoods of Manhattan and the Bronx. He wasn't yet the face of the Genovese family. Few outside the underworld even knew his face. But within the ranks, his reputation was undeniable. He was a capo trusted to oversee lucrative rackets, a man who understood how to balance ambition with caution, and someone Vincent Chin Gigante, the elusive boss, could rely on. In a family built on secrecy, Bellomo was a natural fit. His power base grew strongest in East Harlem and the Bronx. These areas had long been strongholds for the Genovese family, and Barney knew how to nurture that legacy. Construction rackets, gambling operations, and labor unions provided steady revenue, and Bellomo managed them with a level head. Contractors and business owners quickly learned that resistance was futile, but cooperation meant smoother projects and guaranteed protection. Unlike some mobsters who used crude threats, Bellomo's style was measured. He didn't need to shout. His reputation alone was enough to make men listen. The Genovese family thrived under a system of discipline that made them distinct from the other families. While the Gambinos basked in headlines under John Gotti, and while the Colombos fell into bitter internal wars, the Genoveses operated with quiet precision. Gigante's bizarre public act, wandering Greenwich Village in a bathrobe, muttering to himself, convinced outsiders that he was unfit to run anything. Behind the curtain, however, men like Bellomo executed business with ruthless efficiency. The family was considered the most structured and secretive of the five, and Barney's style mirrored that culture perfectly. But the 1990s brought new challenges. Law enforcement, emboldened by victories in the commission trial, turned its attention to younger leaders rising through the mafia ranks. The FBI knew that even with bosses like Gigante insulated by layers of protection, men like Bellomo were vulnerable. They were younger, more active, more directly involved in day-to-day rackets. Surveillance teams followed Barney through the Bronx, noting his meetings, documenting his influence. Agents understood that the new generation might not make the same mistakes as the flamboyant Gotti, but they were determined to catch them nonetheless. For Bellomo, the spotlight of law enforcement was unwelcome but unavoidable. In 1990, his name appeared more frequently in FBI reports, noted as a powerful capo with growing authority. He was careful, but the very size of his influence made him hard to ignore. Federal investigators saw him as a man positioned to rise even higher in the Genovese family, and that made him a target. In 1991, Bellomo was indicted on racketeering charges tied to construction schemes. Prosecutors accused him of extortion, of manipulating contractors, of using union influence to control multi-million-dollar projects across New York. The charges struck at the heart of his empire, threatening to dismantle the careful networks he had built. For the first time, Barney faced the full weight of the government's determination to bring down the mafia. Yet even in court, he carried himself with composure. He wasn't rattled, didn't lash out, didn't play to the cameras. He maintained the same quiet demeanor that had carried him through the streets. To prosecutors, this calmness was infuriating. To his men, it was inspiring. They saw a leader who didn't flinch under pressure, who faced the government's charges with the same patience he applied to business. Convicted in the early 1990s, Bellomo was sentenced to prison. For many mobsters, incarceration spelled the end of influence. But Barney was different. Even behind bars, he retained respect. His crews continued to operate. Captains still deferred to him, and his reputation only grew. The Genovese family valued continuity and discipline, and Bellomo embodied both. He was not forgotten. He was preserved. While serving his sentence, Barney reflected on the changing landscape of organized crime. The mafia of the 1990s was not the same as the one he had entered in the 1970s. Informants were more common, RICO laws were sharper, and the FBI was relentless. But Bellomo also knew that the Genovese family's strength lay in adaptation. Where others fell to chaos, the Genoveses endured by sticking to their principles of secrecy, discretion, and control. Barney fit that mold, and his role as a future leader only solidified. By the mid-1990s, his name once again surfaced as law enforcement linked him to high-level meetings and decisions within the Genovese family. Even in custody, he was seen as a figure with influence, someone the family looked to for direction. The FBI considered him not just a capo, but a candidate for higher leadership, and that made him even more dangerous in their eyes. In 1996, Bellomo faced another indictment, this time tied to racketeering charges that spanned extortion, gambling, and construction schemes. Prosecutors painted him as a rising boss, a man who was shaping the future of the Genovese family. The charges added years to his sentence, keeping him confined as the government worked to weaken the family from the inside out. But despite the mounting charges, Bellomo's influence didn't wane. If anything, his reputation grew stronger. Among his men, he was admired for his resilience. He had faced the full force of federal prosecution, endured long sentences, and never broke. He didn't turn informant, didn't complain, and didn't show weakness. To the underworld, those qualities were the true measure of a leader. By the late 1990s, Bellomo's story had become one of endurance. He wasn't the loudest or the flashiest, but he had proven that he could survive. In a world where many burned out quickly, Barney was still standing. His patience, his discipline, and his quiet strength made him more than just a capo. He was becoming the embodiment of the Genovese way. And as the century turned, his future loomed large. Though he was behind bars, his name was spoken with respect. Law enforcement knew he would be central to the mafia's next chapter. His men believed he was destined for even greater leadership. And Barney himself understood that survival was not just about enduring the present. It was about positioning for the future. Liborio Bellomo had spent much of the 1990s behind bars, locked away by racketeering charges that were supposed to cut short his career. But instead of fading into irrelevance, he became stronger. In the world of organized crime, survival is often the truest test of leadership. Men rise quickly, enjoy a brief taste of power, and fall to betrayals, indictments, or violence. Few endure the long haul. Barney was proving he could. Even as the years passed, even as younger men tried to stake their claims, his reputation didn't wither. It grew. By the mid to late 1990s, the Genovese family was adapting to a new landscape. The flamboyant reign of John Gotti and the Gambinos had brought massive law enforcement heat across the mafia. Informants emerged at an unprecedented rate, breaking the code of silence that had once been sacred. High-profile bosses were falling in rapid succession, but the Genoveses, thanks to their structure and discipline, remained the most resilient of the five families. The system Vincent Chin Gigante had perfected, layers of insulation, careful delegation, and strict secrecy, allowed the family to maintain order even as other families stumbled. Within the system, Barney Bellomo became increasingly important. Though he was in prison, his loyalty never wavered. He didn't complain, didn't seek shortcuts, didn't even hint at betrayal. In a world where men who once swore lifelong loyalty were flipping to save themselves, Barney stood firm. That loyalty was noticed. Inside prison, captains and soldiers whispered his name with respect. On the outside, his reputation grew as someone who could be counted on, someone who embodied the Genovese way. His resilience became a contrast to the chaos elsewhere. The Colombos were torn apart by civil war, Gambino leadership was in disarray after Gotti's conviction, and even the Lucchese's were destabilized by internal strife and betrayals. But the Genoveses continued to project stability, and Barney became a symbol of that stability. His imprisonment did not weaken his stature, it reinforced it. He had faced the government's best efforts and remained intact. By the early 2000s, when whispers of Gigante's declining health began to circulate, the question of succession became pressing. Who would guide the Genovese family into the next generation? Barney, despite being relatively young compared to the old guard, was a natural candidate. He was in his 40s, seasoned by years of leadership and hardened by prison. He carried the respect of both his peers and the soldiers who looked up to him. Most importantly, he embodied the values that made the Genoveses unique: discretion, patience, loyalty, and endurance. Prosecutors and FBI agents noted this as well. Reports in the early 2000s identified Bellomo as a rising figure within the Genovese hierarchy, a man with the potential to shape the family's future. They recognized that he was different from the flamboyant dons they had pursued before. He didn't chase headlines, didn't cultivate a public persona, and didn't let his name become fodder for gossip. Instead, he moved quietly, letting his reputation build without fanfare. For the FBI, that made him harder to pin down. For the Genoveses, that made him invaluable. When Gigante's legal troubles escalated and his health declined, leadership shifted within the family. By then, Barney's position was undeniable. Even though he still faced restrictions and periodic legal battles, his influence continued to grow. Captains deferred to him, soldiers respected him, and his steady hand guided decisions. He wasn't loud, wasn't flamboyant, but he didn't need to be. His authority came from years of proven loyalty and quiet control. Outside the walls of prison, the city was changing. The construction industry, long a stronghold of mafia influence, was under constant surveillance. Unions that had once answered without hesitation now faced scrutiny from federal monitors. Gambling rackets adapted to new forms, from traditional card games to sports betting operations that spanned boroughs. Through it all, Bellomo's crews maintained influence. His name remained linked to East Harlem, the Bronx, and Manhattan rackets that continued to provide steady revenue for the family. The Genovese family's resilience during this period stood out. While the other families scrambled to recover from weakened leadership, the Genoveses projected an image of continuity. They avoided public wars, avoided flamboyant bosses, and avoided the kind of instability that brought unwanted attention. Barney's style was a reflection of this philosophy. He believed in keeping his head down, in surviving the storm, rather than charging into it. He knew the value of waiting, of letting others stumble while he stayed steady. By the early 2000s, his legend was sealed. He had entered the mafia as a young man in the 1970s, survived the law enforcement crackdowns of the 1980s, endured the prosecutions of the 1990s, and emerged not broken but stronger. He was still relatively young compared to the aging bosses around him, and that gave him an advantage. He was seen not just as a survivor, but as the bridge to the next generation of leadership. To the FBI, this was both fascinating and frustrating. Their files noted that Liborio Bellomo was among the most disciplined leaders of his time, a man who refused to make the mistakes of others. They suspected his influence was vast, but pinning concrete evidence to him was difficult. Unlike Gotti, he didn't hold court in social clubs, inviting bugs and surveillance. Unlike Castellano, he didn't build a visible empire that made him vulnerable. Barney's genius was in being ordinary in appearance, but extraordinary in control. By the middle of the decade, as Gigante faded from the scene, Bellomo's name was increasingly spoken in whispers as the man shaping the future of the Genoveses. He had endured trials, prison, and scrutiny, yet emerged with his influence intact. His survival was no accident. It was the result of patience, loyalty, and the refusal to let ego undo him. The quiet young man from East Harlem had become one of the most important figures in organized crime, not through spectacle, but through silence. And as the new century unfolded, his challenge was no longer just survival, it was leadership, steering a family that prided itself on secrecy through a world where secrecy was harder to maintain than ever. When Vincent Chin Gigante finally left the stage in the early 2000s, both through prison and deteriorating health, the Genovese family faced a critical question: who would carry the mantle of the most disciplined, secretive, and powerful of New York's 5 families? Unlike other families, which often fractured during transitions, the Genoveses had always prided themselves on seamless shifts in leadership. Their structure was designed not around a single flamboyant figure, but around continuity. And in that design, Liborio Bellomo emerged as the man most suited to lead. By then, Barney was in his 40s, and already a legend within the ranks. He had proven his resilience through multiple indictments, long prison sentences, and relentless federal pressure. His loyalty to the family never wavered, and his calm, measured demeanor gave him credibility among both the old guard and the younger generation. While others might have faltered under the spotlight of law enforcement, Barney thrived in the shadows. He was exactly the kind of leader the Genoveses needed to maintain their reputation as the most stable of the 5 families. Unlike the Gambinos who stumbled through Gotti's downfall and the chaos that followed, the Genoveses did not crown a flamboyant replacement. Their power was collective, and Bellomo became the quiet force steering that collective. His leadership wasn't about titles or headlines, it was about influence. Captains respected him, soldiers followed him, and rivals recognized his steady hand. He didn't need to boast about his position. Everyone already knew where his authority rested. In the 2000s, federal prosecutors continued to target the mafia with the same tools that had proven successful in the 1980s and 90s. Wiretaps, informants, and RICO charges remained the government's preferred weapons. But Bellomo adapted. He understood that the old methods of doing business, social clubs filled with chatter, large public gatherings of soldiers, were no longer safe. He emphasized discretion, smaller circles, and careful communication. The Genovese family under his influence became less visible, less noisy, and harder to penetrate. Still, law enforcement knew who he was. FBI reports in the early 2000s listed him as a central figure in the family, a man with the potential to be the official boss, even if he didn't claim the title outright. They tracked his movements, tapped phones of his associates, and monitored construction and union contracts that bore the faint marks of Genovese influence. But Bellomo's ability to operate quietly frustrated them. Unlike Gotti, he gave them no soundbites. Unlike Castellano, he gave them no corporate empires to dismantle. He moved through the city like a shadow, present but rarely caught in the light. During this time, the Genoveses maintained their dominance in traditional rackets. Gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and construction remained the pillars of their wealth. Bellomo's crews were particularly strong in Manhattan and the Bronx, where his roots ran deepest. He ensured that contractors and developers understood the rules. Projects moved smoothly when the family's interests were respected, and projects stalled when they weren't. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet pressure, applied steadily until compliance became the only option. Barney's influence extended beyond business. He became a symbol of continuity in a world where continuity was rare. The mafia of the 2000s was under siege, with federal cases dismantling families piece by piece. Informants like Gravano had exposed networks that once seemed unbreakable. Younger members across the 5 families were less disciplined, more reckless, more willing to chase fast profits at the expense of secrecy. But Barney embodied the old ways. He was patient, discreet, and deeply loyal to tradition. To many within the Genoveses, he represented not just leadership, but identity, the living proof that their family remained the most disciplined of them all. Of course, his resilience made him a target. In 2006, Bellomo was once again indicted, charged in a broad racketeering case that included extortion and illegal gambling. Prosecutors presented him as a high-ranking leader of the Genovese family, accusing him of directing operations from behind the scenes. But even as the government tried to pin him down, Barney maintained his composure. He served time, accepted his sentence, and never gave an inch. Each return to prison was treated not as a defeat, but as another test of endurance, one he always passed. In the underworld, this only enhanced his reputation. Soldiers admired his consistency. No matter how many times the government came for him, he never broke, never talked, never lost his calm. Captains trusted him even more, seeing in him the rare quality of a leader who could absorb pressure without collapsing. And younger members looked up to him as a model of what survival looked like in a world where survival was the hardest skill to master. By the late 2000s, Bellomo's name was spoken with a mixture of respect and caution. He wasn't just another capo. He wasn't even just a leader. He was the embodiment of the Genovese way, quiet, disciplined, enduring. His influence wasn't measured in headlines or flamboyant displays, but in the quiet efficiency of rackets that continued to generate millions without drawing the kind of heat that destroyed other families. The FBI never stopped watching. They knew Bellomo was central to the family's survival, even if they couldn't always prove it in court. They monitored associates, built cases, and tried to tie him directly to the crimes they knew he orchestrated. But catching Barney was never easy. He had learned from the mistakes of others, and he avoided the pitfalls that trapped so many of his contemporaries. His genius lay in being ordinary, in blending into the background while quietly pulling the strings. The Genoveses, under Bellomo's influence, remained strong. Their structure, discipline, and commitment to secrecy kept them from unraveling the way the other families had. In a world where flashy bosses burned out quickly, Barney's style kept the family steady. He didn't need to prove himself with noise. His very survival was proof enough. As the decade closed, Liborio Bellomo stood as one of the most important figures of his generation. He had risen from the streets of East Harlem to become the quiet hand guiding one of the most powerful families in the American underworld. He had endured indictments, prison sentences, and relentless scrutiny, and yet he was still standing. His patience, his caution, and his loyalty had carried him further than most, and his influence was only growing. The story of Barney in the 2000s was not about dramatic explosions or violent showdowns. It was about quiet dominance, about surviving where others fell, about guiding the Genoveses through an era where survival itself was the greatest victory. The new decade brought with it new challenges for organized crime. The 2010s were nothing like the golden years of the mafia. Surveillance technology had advanced far beyond wiretaps in payphones or bugs in club backrooms. Smartphones could be tracked, encrypted chats could be infiltrated, and federal prosecutors were more aggressive than ever. Cooperators, once rare, were now a reality the mafia had to live with. Dozens of men who once swore lifelong loyalty were cutting deals with the government. For many, the very foundation of La Cosa Nostra seemed to be eroding. And yet, through this storm, the Genovese family remained resilient. Unlike other families which lurched from one crisis to the next, the Genoveses maintained a sense of continuity. Much of that stability came from the quiet, steady hand of Liborio Bellomo. By now, he was no longer just a capo or a rising leader. He was recognized within law enforcement reports and underworld whispers alike as one of the central figures guiding the family's future. Bellomo's style had always been about patience and invisibility, and in the 2010s that approach proved more valuable than ever. Where others had crumbled under the glare of media attention, men like John Gotti before him, Barney thrived in obscurity. He didn't pose for cameras, didn't bask in headlines, didn't allow his name to become a fixture of tabloid stories. To the average New Yorker, his name meant nothing. To insiders, it meant everything. He was the man who quietly kept the most powerful mafia family alive while others fell apart. In 2011, a sweeping indictment targeted members of all 5 families in what prosecutors called one of the largest mafia roundups in U.S. history. More than 100 men were charged in a coordinated strike across New York and New Jersey. Bellomo's name surfaced again, tied to gambling, extortion, and racketeering. The government portrayed him as a top-level figure, a man whose influence stretched across crews and boroughs. But even in the face of these charges, Barney's composure never wavered. He pleaded, he served, and he endured, as he always had. His resilience in the face of repeated indictments only strengthened his legend. To the FBI, he was a frustrating enigma. Each time they believed they had clipped his wings, he emerged intact, his influence seemingly untouched. To his men, he was the embodiment of loyalty. He never wavered, never cooperated, never abandoned the family. He absorbed the pressure and carried on. In an era when betrayal was common, that loyalty was priceless. Throughout the 2010s, the Genovese family under Bellomo's influence continued to thrive in low-key but lucrative rackets. Sports betting, loan sharking, construction, and labor unions remained staples, but the family also adapted to newer opportunities. The spread of offshore gambling operations, online betting, and even infiltration of new business fronts gave the Genoveses steady revenue streams. Bellomo's philosophy never changed. Avoid flash, avoid spectacle, and ensure stability. His men followed that example, keeping their heads down while quietly earning. One of the most striking aspects of Bellomo's leadership during this period was how little the outside world knew about him. Reporters could fill pages with stories about flamboyant mobsters of the past, but when it came to Barney, information was scarce. He was not seen in nightclubs, not photographed in expensive suits, not caught flaunting wealth. Instead, he cultivated invisibility. In many ways, he was the anti-Gotti, the man who ruled by being unseen rather than unforgettable. This invisibility was not weakness, it was strength. Law enforcement had an easier time prosecuting men who craved the spotlight. Barney denied them that luxury. When his name appeared in indictments, it was usually buried deep in the text, his influence implied but rarely detailed. Prosecutors struggled to find cooperators willing to testify against him. His reputation for loyalty was so strong that even those who flipped often avoided mentioning him. In the mafia, where betrayal had become routine, Barney remained a figure shrouded in silence. By the mid-2010s, federal agents openly acknowledged that the Genovese family was still the most disciplined and secretive of the 5. Their structure, refined over decades, allowed them to operate with less exposure than the others. And while other families cycled through leaders who burned out quickly, the Genoveses had Bellomo, a steady, consistent figure whose survival became a symbol of the family's philosophy. Even in his 60s, Barney's influence did not fade. Younger generations of mobsters looked to him as proof that patience could still pay off. While many of their contemporaries in other families were being swept into prison or turning informant, The Genovese crews under Barney's quiet oversight continued to thrive. They weren't making headlines, but they were making money. And in the end, money and survival were all that mattered. Law enforcement, of course, never stopped watching. Indictments in 2016 once again named Bellomo, tying him to racketeering and extortion in Manhattan. Prosecutors pointed to him as a man still deeply involved in the family's business. But the same pattern repeated itself. Charges, court appearances, quiet endurance, and eventual return. It was as though nothing could break him. Each time the government tried, Barney absorbed the blow and carried on. The nickname Quiet Don began to surface in law enforcement circles and media reports. It captured his essence perfectly. He wasn't flamboyant, wasn't reckless, wasn't interested in being remembered as a larger-than-life character. He was quiet, disciplined, and enduring. He represented a new kind of boss for a new era, not the gangster who posed for cameras, but the strategist who lived in shadows. By the end of the 2010s, Bellomo stood as one of the last true survivors of the mafia's modern era. He had risen from the streets of East Harlem, endured decades of indictments, and emerged as the steady hand guiding the Genovese family through one of its most turbulent chapters. His secret was simple: patience, loyalty, and invisibility. He never burned too brightly, and therefore he was never extinguished. The story of Liborio Barney Bellomo in the 2010s was not about spectacular violence or dramatic downfall. It was about quiet dominance, about surviving in a world where survival was the rarest skill of all. He was the man who proved that in the mafia of the modern age, the loudest voice was not the strongest. The quietest was. By the time the late 2010s arrived, Liborio Barney Bellomo had become something rare in the world of organized crime, a living symbol of endurance. Decades earlier, when he was just another young man in East Harlem learning the ropes, few could have imagined that he would outlast so many of his contemporaries. Bosses who were once feared and respected had fallen, some to bullets, others to betrayals, and most to federal indictments that ended in life sentences. Yet Barney was still standing, not untouched, not invisible, but undeniably present, guiding the Genovese family with the same quiet strength that had carried him since his youth. At 60 years old, most men might have thought of retirement, but in the underworld, age carried authority. To the younger soldiers and associates of the Genovese family, Barney wasn't just another leader. He was a legend, a man whose life was proof that patience could still conquer in an era where recklessness had destroyed so many. His survival was not luck, it was discipline. He had lived through the commission trial years, the law enforcement onslaught of the 1990s, the chaos of the Gotti era, and the high-tech surveillance of the 2000s. And now, as the 2020s approached, his reputation as the Quiet Don solidified. What set Barney apart was his ability to adapt. In earlier decades, social clubs had been the lifeblood of mafia operations, places where crews gathered, information flowed, and orders were given. But by the 2010s, those clubs were death traps, bugged and watched constantly by the FBI. Bellomo shifted away from those habits. Meetings were smaller, conversations more discreet, and communication lines carefully chosen. He understood that every word could be recorded, every call traced, every associate flipped. His genius was in adjusting without ever appearing to. Federal authorities continued to pursue him. Indictments in 2016 and again in 2019 tied him to racketeering and gambling schemes, presenting him as one of the family's top figures. In court, prosecutors described him as a powerful leader who directed operations across New York. But once again, the pattern held. Accusations, charges, and Barney's steady endurance. He faced the government with calm, accepted what came, and emerged intact. Even when sentences interrupted his freedom, they never severed his influence. His crews remained loyal, his captains continued to respect him, and the family's stability endured. The Genovese family in the late 2010s continued to project strength. While other families struggled with internal divisions, informants, and weakened leadership, the Genoveses operated with the same disciplined secrecy that had defined them for generations. Barney was central to that. He wasn't the loudest voice in the room, but he didn't need to be. His authority came from decades of loyalty, survival, and quiet control. He had become the very embodiment of the Genovese philosophy: power in silence, strength in patience, victory in endurance. His survival also highlighted the contrast with the decline of other mafia figures. The Gambinos, once dominant under Gotti, were shadows of their former selves by the 2010s, fractured by indictments and betrayals. The Colombos had been torn apart by civil wars in the 1990s and never truly recovered. The Lucchese's faced repeated leadership crises, their bosses imprisoned or flipped. Even the once feared Bonanos, weakened by high-profile cooperators like Joe Massino, struggled to maintain credibility. In that landscape, the Genoveses stood out. They were not untouched, but they were steady, and much of that steadiness was credited to Bellomo's influence. By the early 2020s, the FBI and prosecutors acknowledged that the Genovese family remained one of the most structured crime organizations in the country. Their influence stretched through gambling, construction, loan sharking, and labor unions, much as it had decades earlier. But their strength also lay in their ability to adapt, to avoid spectacle, to blend into the fabric of legitimate industries. Barney, now in his 60s, was seen as the figure who embodied that ability. Unlike flamboyant dons who craved the spotlight, Barney remained almost invisible to the public. Few photographs of him circulated, fewer stories filled tabloids. To the average New Yorker, his name meant nothing. To those who lived in the underworld, or those who worked in the FBI, it meant everything. His invisibility was his shield, and it worked. Even as the years wore on, his legend grew, not from what people saw, but from what they didn't. He didn't grandstand, didn't flaunt, didn't crumble. He simply endured. And in the mafia, endurance was often the rarest victory of all. The 2020s also brought new realities. Technology was everywhere. Cameras on every corner, financial transactions tracked, phones monitored. The very fabric of secrecy that the mafia had once relied upon was harder to maintain than ever. Yet the Genoveses, under Barney's quiet hand, adjusted. They leaned into smaller rackets, diversified into businesses that blended with legitimate fronts, and avoided the high-risk, high-profile ventures that drew federal attention. The family's strength was not in expansion, but in preservation, ensuring their presence in the city remained steady, even if less visible. Bellomo himself became something almost mythical. To the younger men who joined the family, he was the living link to the old world, a man who had seen everything and survived it all. To the FBI, he was the one they could never quite break, the man who embodied the frustration of pursuing an organization that refused to collapse. To history, he was becoming the archetype of the modern Don, not the one who chased fame, but the one who ruled from shadows. As the early 2020s unfolded, Bellomo's legacy was clear. He had started as a quiet young man in East Harlem, risen through the ranks of the Genovese family, endured decades of indictments, and emerged as one of the last great survivors of the mafia's modern era. His story was not about noise or spectacle. It was about patience, silence, and survival. He proved that in a world where most burned out quickly, the man who stayed quiet outlasted them all. That's part 6, 12,000 characters. Bellomo, in the late 2010s and early 2020s, continued indictments, steady influence, contrast with the collapse of other families and his transformation into a symbol of endurance and invisibility. By the time the 2020s were underway, Liborio Bellomo had become more than a name in FBI files or whispers in social clubs. He was a figure of mythology. To his men, he was the definition of resilience, the man who proved that patience and discipline could outlast surveillance, indictments, and even time itself. To prosecutors and agents, he was a reminder of why the mafia, though diminished from its golden age, could never be dismissed completely. Barney was living proof that even in an era of high-tech surveillance and constant legal pressure, old-world caution could still prevail. In his 60s, he no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. His life story was already legend. He had started as a teenager in East Harlem, risen through the ranks with a reputation for loyalty, endured prison sentences in the 1990s and 2000s, and returned each time without a hint of betrayal. Unlike others who broke under pressure, Barney held steady. Unlike others who craved attention, he stayed invisible. And unlike others who sought reckless expansion, he favored survival. His men admired him not for being flashy, but for being unshakable. The Genovese family, under his quiet influence, reflected his style. They were not loud, not flamboyant, and not eager for headlines. They moved in the shadows, controlling businesses that appeared legitimate on the surface while quietly earning millions underneath. Sports betting, loan sharking, and construction remained staples. But the family also adapted to newer opportunities, slipping into industries where oversight was weaker and profits were steady. The key wasn't risk, it was endurance. And Barney's voice, though rarely raised, carried weight in steering that direction. What made Bellomo unique among mafia leaders of his era was how little the public knew of him. He wasn't a tabloid figure like John Gotti, whose every move was chronicled in newspapers. He wasn't a courtroom spectacle like Carmine Persico or Vincent Gigante. He was a shadow. Few outside of law enforcement or the underworld could have picked him out of a lineup. This invisibility was his greatest shield. By never becoming a household name, he avoided the kind of public obsession that destroyed so many others. Law enforcement continued to watch him, of course. Every indictment that mentioned his name was treated as a chance to finally pull him down for good. In 2019, charges once again tied him to racketeering in Manhattan, but the results followed the same script: accusations, legal maneuvers, and Barney's calm endurance. To the FBI, it was frustrating. To his men, it was inspiring. The message was clear. No matter how many times they came for him, he remained. The myth of the Quiet Don grew during this period. It wasn't just a nickname, it was an identity. Reporters used it sparingly, law enforcement whispered it, and his men embraced it. In a world where so many bosses were undone by their own egos, Barney's refusal to draw attention became legendary. The less people saw of him, the more his myth grew. He became the invisible figure behind one of the strongest families in America, the man whose absence in the spotlight was itself proof of his power. At the same time, the public narrative around the mafia was shifting. Prosecutors and FBI officials declared repeatedly that organized crime was a shadow of its former self. The days of the five families dominating New York were over, they said. They pointed to waves of convictions, to informants, to younger generations uninterested in the old codes. And yet, behind those declarations, families like the Genoveses quietly endured. Their presence in unions, construction, and gambling remained. Their ability to blend into legitimate industries made them harder to dismantle. And at the center of that endurance stood Bellomo, a man who proved the mafia was not gone. It had simply adapted. For Barney, survival was the ultimate victory. He didn't need to be remembered as the most powerful, the richest, or the most feared. He needed only to be remembered as the one who endured. He outlasted bosses who once seemed untouchable. He outlasted prosecutors who once swore they'd bury him. He outlasted the flashy era of the Gotti years, the chaos of the 1990s, and the wave of betrayals that tore apart other families. Through it all, he stayed quiet, stayed patient, and stayed loyal. In his 60s, he carried himself with the calm of a man who knew he had already proven everything. Younger men looked to him for guidance not just in business but in philosophy. He taught by example: speak less, act carefully, avoid risks, and stay loyal. His legacy was not built on spectacular violence or dramatic gestures, but on the art of survival. To those who followed him, that was more powerful than any tabloid headline. Even as technology made secrecy harder, Barney adapted. He understood that every move had to be calculated, every word considered. He avoided the traps that ensnared others, avoided the temptations of easy money through high-risk rackets, and avoided the arrogance of believing he could never fall. His humility, rare among bosses, kept him steady. He didn't think himself invincible. He thought himself prepared. That difference meant everything. By the early to mid-2020s, Liborio Bellomo stood as one of the last great survivors of the mafia's modern era. He wasn't immortal and he wasn't untouchable, but he was enduring. And in a world where endurance was rare, that made him extraordinary. His story had become more than just the tale of a mob boss. It had become the story of resilience itself, the proof that patience and silence could outlast chaos and noise. The man who began as a quiet boy in East Harlem, who rose through the Genovese family without seeking the spotlight, who endured prison and indictments, was now in his 60s, still guiding, still surviving, still proving that the quietest voice could sometimes be the strongest of all. By the time the mid-2020s arrived, Liborio Bellomo was no longer simply a name whispered in neighborhood clubs or mentioned in sealed FBI reports. He had become the standard by which the Genovese family measured itself. His decades of resilience were not only impressive to his men, but also frustrating to those sworn to bring him down. To the FBI, he was a symbol of everything elusive about the mafia, a man who should have been broken by indictments and prison sentences, but instead emerged each time more respected, more steady, more untouchable. The government's strategy in those years mirrored the approach they had taken since the commission trial: relentless surveillance, sweeping racketeering indictments, and the use of cooperators. Yet Barney had built his entire life on withstanding those very tactics. He had never been reckless with his words, never indulged in grand displays that could be recorded, and never surrounded himself with men he didn't trust. He had learned from the mistakes of others, and he lived by a code that made him harder to penetrate. In an era when surveillance technology could track a man's every move, his greatest strength was remaining unremarkable in the eyes of the public. Federal prosecutors continued to insist that the mafia was weaker than ever. Press conferences highlighted arrests, indictments, and convictions as proof that the five families had been reduced to fragments of what they once were. And yet, cases kept surfacing that proved the families were far from gone. Gambling rings, loan operations, construction rackets, all continued to surface in indictments. Time and again, the Genovese family's name appeared, and almost always, somewhere in the narrative, so did Bellomo's. He was the invisible thread running through decades of persistence. What frustrated agents most was how little they could prove beyond implication. Indictments often painted Barney as a leader, as someone guiding operations from the shadows. But when pressed in court, the evidence was rarely enough to crush him fully. His survival wasn't just about loyalty or reputation, it was about his discipline. He avoided unnecessary conversations, avoided places that drew attention, and avoided the arrogance that doomed others. While some bosses had been their own worst enemies, Barney became his own shield. Meanwhile, within the Genovese family, his influence was profound. Crews that operated in Manhattan and the Bronx continued to thrive under his quiet oversight. Younger men, eager to make their mark, were reminded again and again that spectacle was death, while silence was survival. Barney's example became almost like a manual for the modern mafia. Where other families allowed younger leaders to chase headlines or quick profits, the Genoveses leaned into Barney's model: slow, steady, profitable, and quiet. Comparisons to past bosses became inevitable. Historians, journalists, and even prosecutors began to ask where Bellomo fit among the great names of the mafia. Was he a strategist like Carlo Gambino, who favored invisibility and quiet power? Was he a manipulator like Vincent Gigante, who hid his cunning behind eccentricity? Or was he something else entirely? A man shaped by decades of law enforcement pressure, who refined the art of survival in ways no one before him had been forced to. To his men, there was no question. Barney was the blueprint. He wasn't as dramatic as Gotti, not as feared as Luciano, not as eccentric as Gigante, but he was steady, and in the end, steady was what mattered. When others had fallen, Barney remained. He had survived enough decades that his longevity itself became power. In a world where turnover at the top was often measured in years, his ability to remain influential for decades made him extraordinary. For the FBI, he became something more than just another mobster. They saw him as the challenge that defined their work. Each new indictment that carried his name was framed as an attempt to finally close the chapter on him. Yet each time, he endured. To some agents, he was a ghost who proved that organized crime could adapt faster than the government could dismantle it. To prosecutors, he was the frustrating reminder that silence could be stronger than any lawyer. The myth of the Quiet Don grew during this period. It wasn't just a nickname anymore. It was a recognition of what he represented. In an era where the mafia had lost much of its cultural power, Barney became the face of its persistence. His invisibility became his legend. He wasn't on magazine covers, wasn't followed by paparazzi, wasn't discussed at dinner tables. But in the neighborhoods where the Genovese family still operated, his name carried a weight that no headline could replicate. As the mid-2020s unfolded, Bellomo's health and age began to attract speculation. He was in his late 60s now, still steady, but no one could escape time forever. Law enforcement wondered if his eventual decline would leave the Genoveses vulnerable. His men, however, believed that his influence would outlast him. The structures he reinforced, the discipline he demanded, and the example he set were woven into the fabric of the family. Whether present in person or not, his philosophy would endure. In many ways, Bellomo became a bridge between eras. He had lived through the golden age of the mafia in the 1970s and 80s, endured the relentless crackdowns of the 1990s, and adapted to the high-tech surveillance of the 2000s and 2010s. By the 2020s, he wasn't just another boss. He was history itself, walking proof of how the mafia had survived everything thrown at it. His story became less about individual rackets or charges and more about what he symbolized, the art of endurance. He showed that in a world obsessed with noise, silence could be the loudest statement of all. He showed that patience, loyalty, and invisibility could be more powerful than headlines, intimidation, or bravado. And he showed that even as the mafia's grip weakened, its ability to adapt lived on through men like him. The man who had once been just a quiet young figure in East Harlem was now a legend, not because he was feared by all, not because he was the richest, but because he had endured where others hadn't. And in the underworld, endurance was everything. By the late 2020s, Liborio Bellomo had reached an age few mobsters ever lived to see while still maintaining influence. At nearly 70 years old, he stood as a quiet monument to survival in a world where most men burned out long before. He wasn't untouchable. He had endured indictments, prison, and decades of federal pressure. But he was still present, still respected, and still shaping the course of the Genovese family. In the underworld, that kind of longevity was not just rare, it was almost mythic. Younger associates, some barely born when Bellomo first earned his stripes in East Harlem, looked at him with awe. To them, he wasn't just a leader, he was history in motion, a direct link to the old ways. He had lived through the eras of Castellano, Gotti, Gigante, and others who had dominated headlines. He had seen the commission trial tear down an entire generation of bosses. He had endured the flood of informants who gutted families from the inside. And yet, while those names became cautionary tales, Barney remained. Whispers of succession naturally began to surface. No one ruled forever, and even if his influence was as strong as ever, time was undefeated. Captains and soldiers wondered quietly who might eventually carry the family forward. But in the Genovese tradition, succession was never about flamboyant coronations or public announcements. It was about continuity, about ensuring that the discipline of the family remained intact. And Barney, with his careful hand, made sure that whoever rose after him would follow the same path of secrecy and stability. Law enforcement, for their part, never gave up their pursuit. Files on Bellomo grew thicker every year, filled with surveillance reports, snippets from informants, and analyses of his potential successors. To the FBI, He remained the central figure in the Genovese family, a man whose influence stretched across boroughs and industries. They noted his age, but they didn't underestimate him. If anything, his longevity made him more dangerous. He wasn't just a survivor, he was a teacher, passing down methods that made the next generation harder to catch. In the late 2020s, the mafia no longer commanded the cultural dominance it once had. The days of headlines screaming about mob wars and television networks obsessing over bosses were fading. The public's fascination with organized crime had shifted into history books, documentaries, and dramatizations. But the absence of noise didn't mean the absence of presence. Beneath the surface, the structures still existed, the rackets still operated, and the influence still lingered. And in those quiet spaces, Barney's hand could still be felt. His reputation among his men had by then reached near mythical status. Soldiers spoke of his patience as if it were a weapon, his silence as if it were armor. He didn't need to prove himself with threats or displays of wealth. His survival was proof enough. When others were brought down by arrogance or carelessness, Barney remained steady. That steadiness became the lesson he left for everyone who followed. In neighborhoods where the Genovese family had long operated, his influence was still felt, even if his name was rarely spoken aloud. Construction companies, union leaders, and gambling operators knew the quiet rules that ensured things ran smoothly. They might not have seen Barney in person, but they knew he was there, the invisible hand that kept order in a world that survived on discipline. Inside prison systems, among older men who remembered his name from past sentences, he was respected as someone who never broke. Among prosecutors who had faced him in court, he was remembered as a figure who absorbed charges with dignity, never showing panic, never giving them the satisfaction of collapse. And among historians, his name was increasingly placed alongside the great survivors of the mafia's long arc. By the time he neared 70, Bellomo's legacy was already secure. He didn't need to add to it. His endurance was the story. He had lasted longer than most, adapted more effectively than others, and remained truer to the Genovese philosophy than anyone of his generation. He wasn't remembered for a spectacular downfall or a bloody rise. He was remembered for something rarer, quiet survival. The whispers of succession were inevitable. Some pointed to younger capos who had learned directly under his guidance, men shaped by his emphasis on secrecy and patience. Others believed the Genovese family's strength lay not in one successor, but in its collective structure, which Barney himself had reinforced. Whatever the truth, it was clear that his influence would outlive him. His philosophy had become the family's DNA. The FBI often framed the Genovese family as the most disciplined of the five, and Barney as the embodiment of that discipline. His invisibility frustrated them, but it also fascinated them. In reports, agents described him as present but elusive, a man who remained central without ever drawing the kind of attention that made prosecution easy. They knew his time would eventually end, but they also knew his influence would linger far beyond. For the public, Bellomo was barely a figure at all. Unlike the famous dons who filled front pages, he remained in shadows. But in that obscurity lay his strength. He didn't need fame to validate him. His men knew who he was. His rivals knew what he represented. And history, in time, would understand the power of what he achieved. As the decade pressed on, Bellomo's story became less about what rackets he controlled and more about what he symbolized. He was proof that the mafia had not vanished, only adapted. He was proof that patience was still the sharpest weapon, and he was proof that invisibility could be more powerful than spectacle. The quiet young man from East Harlem, who rose without flash, endured indictments without breaking, and guided without boasting, had become one of the last great figures of organized crime's modern era. And as the whispers of succession grew louder, one truth remained. Barney's legacy was already secure, not because of what he shouted, but because of what he never had to say at all. The story of Liborio Barney Bellomo is not the story of explosions in the streets, sensational headlines, or flamboyant gestures. It is the story of endurance, of quiet discipline, of a man who rose from a neighborhood in East Harlem and became one of the most resilient leaders of the Genovese family, not by being loud, but by being steady. His life arc stands apart from the mythology of organized crime, not because it defies it, but because it redefines it. Born in 1957, Bellomo grew up in a city where the mafia's presence was everywhere but rarely spoken about openly. He was a boy who paid attention to detail, who noticed how men carried themselves, who understood early that respect was earned not through force alone but through patience. As he grew, he drifted naturally toward circles that valued loyalty and discipline. He was not a brawler looking for attention. He was a student of power, learning how influence moved quietly through unions, construction, and gambling. By the time he became a man, the Genovese family was already legendary for its discipline. It had produced bosses like Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, and Vincent Gigante, men who understood that real strength was in structure, not noise. Into that tradition stepped Bellomo, who proved himself as a capo in the 1980s, steering crews in Manhattan and the Bronx with efficiency and calm. He was young compared to many of the older leaders, but his maturity set him apart. He didn't make reckless moves. He didn't expose himself unnecessarily. He operated the way the Genoveses expected their best men to operate, quietly, profitably, and loyally. The 1990s tested him as the FBI intensified its war on organized crime. Barney faced indictments, prison sentences, and the relentless attention of federal prosecutors determined to dismantle the five families. Many men broke during those years. Some turned informant, some collapsed under pressure, and some disappeared entirely. Bellomo endured. Even in prison, his loyalty never wavered, and his influence never vanished. His composure in the face of adversity became his signature. Each time the government tried to silence him, he emerged more respected than before. As the 2000s unfolded, his name was increasingly tied to leadership roles within the Genovese family. With Vincent Gigante's decline, Bellomo's influence only grew. He embodied the family's identity: secrecy, discretion, and discipline. While other families were rocked by flamboyant bosses and internal wars, the Genoveses projected stability. That stability had a face, even if it was rarely seen. Barney became the quiet hand guiding the family forward. The 2010s and 2020s cemented his legacy. Indictments continued to surface, yet none could fully topple him. He adapted to the modern age, understanding that technology made secrecy harder but not impossible. He avoided spectacle, avoided arrogance, and avoided the mistakes that doomed so many others. While law enforcement celebrated the decline of organized crime, the Genoveses continued to operate in shadows, their influence woven into industries both old and new. Barney's presence was never loud, but it was constant. By the time he reached his late 60s, his reputation had grown into myth. To the public, he was almost invisible, a name that rarely made headlines. To his men, he was a teacher, a model of how to survive in a world where most didn't. To law enforcement, he was the frustrating reminder that the mafia had not disappeared. It had simply adapted. And to history, he was a bridge, a man who lived through the golden age of the mafia and carried its lessons into the modern era. What makes Bellomo's story remarkable is not just his survival, but the way he survived. He didn't rely on violence to define his name. He didn't rely on flash to create fear. He relied on patience, on silence, on a kind of discipline that was as rare in the underworld as it was effective. His legacy is not one of noise, but of quiet strength. He showed that in a world where attention could be deadly, invisibility was the greatest weapon. Compared to his predecessors and contemporaries,